Okay, so as I mentioned in the previous boxing video, I don't have pay-per-view, so I can't watch fights live. What I did do was looked at the Daily Telegraph round by round updates, and it's a huge upset. Tony Bellew won. Apparently, Hayes corner threw in the towel, and it was a KO. So this is interesting because apparently the O2 was sold out, although this was a non-title fight. Um, I think there was a lot of interest in this fight because you had two guys who both had big mouths, both real boxing talents. But Bellew was the underdog, and a lot of people underestimated him. And he is showing tonight that he really does belong with some of the best fighters in the world. Um, I mean, it's too early to say he's pound for pound top 10, but certainly he is in the reckoning of being in with the heavyweights. And it will have increased his global recognition, I reckon, from this fight. As Michael Buffer said, Britain, London specifically, is now the heavyweight capital of the world, and I think that's true. Of course, Bellew's from Liverpool. I think he might tie with John Conte as Liverpool's greatest ever fighter. There may be a few other figures from earlier in history, but yeah, it's a huge upset. Um, what now for David Hay? Well, firstly, it's a good thing that he's obviously um, he's not seriously injured because he's been talking. He said the better man won. He did mention a rematch. Whether the fight was close enough for that, I don't know because, like I say, I haven't seen it. Whether there's an appetite for a rematch or not, I think the animosity between these guys might mean that there would be a rematch. But I would say this: if there is a rematch and Hay loses that as well, he really should think about retiring. And the thing is, 36 isn't particularly old in boxing these days. There's guys going well into the 40s. So 36 isn't particularly old. Um, it's not exceptionally old. Um, David Hayes still in great shape. But I think, I mean, looking at the press conference and looking at the gloves are off thing, I did think that Hayes seemed a bit distracted and a bit irritated in a way that he's usually more cool than that. So that may have been at play there. But anyway, that's that. So what next? Obviously, Bellew's going to have a lot of options: stay in the heavyweight division or go down again. Um, Bellew versus Joshua. I don't know. If it happens, I don't think it'll happen very soon. Because obviously there's going to be promoters looking at their own markets. Apparently Antonio Tarver has said he wanted to fight the winner of this bout, but Tarver's one of those guys, again, a great fighter, but he's sort of been out of the limelight for quite a while. Whereas I think Bellew now is going to be looking for names that are big at the moment. So yeah, it's interesting. Congratulations to Tony Bellew. Um, it's good to see that both guys embraced after the fight. That's so often the case in boxing. There's some real trash talking, insults coming both ways, and then the two guys, make up afterwards. Although that was true of Ben Eubank, and then the bad blood began again, and there was that rematch in 1993. Um, I think a rematch would only capitalise if there was a guarantee that Hay didn't have injuries or anything. I think the thing about David Hay, I do think he's a great fighter. He's one of the most conditioned fighters that we've ever had, but his career has been somewhat tarnished by injuries, and there's always a sense with Hay that, great as he is, he always was somewhat lacking in the absolute potential he could have had because of there was too many fights fell through, and I think that is going to somewhat cloud his legacy. Um, According to BoxRec, our greatest heavyweight is Lennox Lewis, and they actually have David Hay as number two, Frank Bruno at three, Henry Cooper at four, and I think they have Tyson Fury at five, or Bruce Woodcock. Um, how this loss is going to impact Hayes' legacy, I don't know. I think he's still going to be seen as a great fighter. I think he's still going to be among our top 20 fighters of all time. Um, I mean, if you look at some of the big names on his resume, um, there's some pretty big names there: John Ruiz, Nikolai Valuev. John Mark Mormick. I mean, these guys aren't all-time greats, but they're still significant fighters. Carl Thompson. Well, actually, my mistake. Hay lost to Carl Thompson. Um, but I always got the impression with Hay, he reminds me a little bit of Max Baer. I always get the impression he hasn't. There were fights he just didn't take seriously enough. This is one of them, and I know Hay insists that he did, but I don't know. I think he did underestimate Tony Bellew. And even though Bellew is a bit of a loud talker himself, I think Bellew ultimately showed a little bit more respect. Anyway, that's that. Um, Keeping with boxing, I thought it would be appropriate. I'm not going to talk too much about Furman Garcia because that hasn't happened yet. Obviously, with the time difference, I think it's in Vegas. It's going to be in a few hours. It's just after midnight here in the UK, so that's the other big fight tonight. There's been limited coverage of that here in the UK because obviously we've had to focus on Hay Bellew. And if it wasn't for Hay Bellew, I think there would be more focus on Garcia Furman. The welterweight division, in my opinion, this is real golden era for the welterweights. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens with that one. What I want to talk about actually is the history, the origins of modern boxing. Now, boxing is an ancient sport. Its origins go back to ancient Greece. It goes back to the ancient Olympics. So we're talking 27 centuries, 27, 28 centuries. But I'm not going to talk at great length about the boxing of the classical world because it was very different than today. It was called Pancration, I believe, and it was very bloody. There was virtually no rules. It was um, even different from what we think of as bare knuckle prize fighting in the Victorian period. Even that had some rules. With ancient Pancration, it was just, and if I'm mispronouncing that, I'll amend it in the annotations. That was a very different thing, very, very brutal. That is, if ancient historians are to be believed, they were prone to exaggeration as well. Um, Between the classical world, let's say the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the 18th century, there isn't records of what we now know as boxing are few and far between. In some cultures, there were sort of equivalents of boxing. For example, in Kievan Rus, now Russia, there was Kolechny Boy, Russian boxing. It was a form of fist fighting. It was a sort of martial art, but that was more a folk tradition rather than a really organized sport with competition and so on. And certainly in medieval Europe, there would have been many local customs. Apparently, medieval Italy had kind of fist fighting customs. What we know now as boxing in the conventional modern sense can first be traced back. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the origins of this based on Wikipedia and some other sources. That's my source material. The first record we have of a post classical boxing match, in the sense of being a boxing match, dates back to 1681. London Protestant Mercury documented a fight between the Duke of Albemarle's butler and his baker. Um, and basically, the details of as follows. It took place in Britain. It doesn't specify where, but Christopher Monk, the second Duke of Albemarle, who was later Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, so think British lord, engineered a bout between his butler and his butcher, with the latter winning the prize. Very few details available on that. I've tried to look at other sources. The only sources that do exist on this simply state that there is no further details about where it took place, presumably on the Lord's estate, nothing else. Um, the first English bare knuckle champion was James Figg, 1719, so we're talking almost 3 centuries ago. And this is also notable as the time when boxing first came to be used. So we could say that's when boxing was introduced to the English language. Of course, at this time it was very different in the sense that there was fist fighting, but there was also cudgeling, fencing, that was all thrown into the mix. But the very fact there was fist fighting in that really could be called the origins of what then became boxing. Early fighting had no written rules, and it's that's why it has a reputation for being brutal, very chaotic. An early article on boxing was published in Nottingham in 1713 by Sir Thomas Parkins, a successful wrestler from the village of Bunny in Nottinghamshire, who practiced the techniques they've described. Very often in those days, you had practitioners of other martial arts like fencing, wrestling, who would then kind of develop what was very early boxing. The first codified boxing rules were called Broughton's Rules, and they were introduced by the champion James Broughton, Jack Broughton, in 1743 to protect fighters. So, in some ways, that could be seen really as the epoch of modern boxing, in the sense it was the first time codified rules were used. Um, Under these rules, if a man went down and could no longer continue after a count of 30 seconds, the fight was over. Hitting a down fighter and grasping below the waist were prohibited. Broughton encouraged the use of mufflers, so we think of boxing gloves, a form of padded bandage or mitten. Of course, not the same as boxing gloves we have today, but in a sense, a early form of boxing gloves. 1743, so we're talking about 270 years ago, roughly. Um, then moving forward a century, incidentally, in that time period, especially during the Regency, bare knuckle contests were very popular and they usually attracted huge crowds. One famous match was Tom Cribb versus Tom Molyneux for the heavyweight championship of England, 1811. Very often they took place at rural locations, which is a difference from today, obviously, where big fights take place in stadiums and cities. In those days, they tended to take place in fields in the countryside. Cambridgeshire and East Anglia tended to be a big hotspot for prize fights. Also, Hertfordshire, there was an area called No Man's Land where prize fights were common, but they took place all over England and in parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, but especially in rural England. Very often men had seconds, which is why today, where that term seconds comes from. Of course, today seconds are cut men, and you would never have a situation where a cut man then, enters the ring and fights himself, unless you have a riot. Um, and this was legal until well into the 19th century. And very often lords, including right up to the Prince Regent himself, placed wagers on fighters, and fighters were celebrities. So this, in that sense, it was sort of getting into the modern sense of boxing. Obviously, there were big differences, but it was starting to resemble boxing in the sense that champions were celebrities of their day. They would sign autographs. They would people would write books about them. So they were celebrities, and it was very brutal stuff. Of course, rounds went on long, long periods. Britain is the country that really brought this into the forefront, but of course, with the expansion of the British Empire, this moved into Anglophone countries, into the United States, the 13 colonies, into Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Um, if you've seen Gangs of New York, obviously every port city had a real boxing culture because that came with the nature of a port city being a hub for immigration. Um, and so this British blood sport was exported overseas. Um, Very often there was discrepancy over who the champion was because there was no governing body. It was really right up until well into the 20th century, it was about newspaper decisions. So it was very corrupt. Um, and that was definitely something that was a contentious issue. And especially in the case of the States, there was a real racial dynamic. It was in the UK as well. However, black fighters could more freely fight in Europe than they could in North America at that time. So 1743, 1867, another big turning point. That was the year that the Marquess of Queensberry rules were drafted by John Chambers, who was an all-round sportsman. He was actually not a specialist in boxing. He was involved in many other sports, but that's when the first, in a sense, modern codified rules started to be set up, and that is when gloves were really introduced. Now, the Victorian period was interesting because when we think of bare knuckle boxing, it was popular during the Regency, which was the period just before the Victorian period. Um, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert actually they shunned blood sports, so they shunned bare knuckle boxing, they shunned bear baiting, they shunned dog fights. Anything considered a blood sport, they saw as uncivilized for a great empire. So it was kind of driven underground. It certainly still happened, but it was driven underground. Um, and I believe in the 1850s, bare knuckle boxing was actually made illegal in Britain. Of course, it continued, but it was illegal. And very often you would have situations where magistrates would be paid off. A lot of corruption took place. Anyway, then we get into the 20th century. Obviously, rounds at that time, at the early part of the 20th century, much longer. In the United States, there was, well, there were some early fights. There was that color bar in which black fighters could not fight white fighters. So there was that racial dynamic, which meant that black fighters, great black fighters like Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette, had to come to Europe to fight. I didn't mention Jack Johnson because although Johnson was a great fighter and seen as a pioneer, he wanted to be the only black champion. So in his own way, he was quite arrogant. He was the forerunner to Muhammad Ali in his arrogance. Very brave man in his own sense because he went up against baying, white supremacist mobs. And every time Johnson won a fight, there was race riots. So we're talking about a real palpable, you know, something that's hard to comprehend today. Um, Although that did, there was certainly racial dynamics right up until we think of Cooney Holmes in 1982. Um, anyway, not to go off on a tangent. So, getting into the 20th century, rounds were still much longer than they are today. Um, and there was a famous fight between Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh in Paris, 1909. It went on for something, I don't know the exact figure, but it went on for something in the region of 4.5 hours. Complete bloodbath. You see fighters today exhausted after 12 rounds, and you can't blame them. Um, it's difficult to imagine the sheer grit that these men must have had. And I feel that sometimes Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh get greatly overshadowed by Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was not the only black fighter around at that time. There was Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Sam Langford, all great fighters in their own right who would have had far more recognition had Johnson not kind of hogged the limelight in that sense. Um, so then we get into the 20th century. 1960s, obviously, the mob had a big role in boxing, and the 50s. Um, 15 rounds to 12 rounds, I believe that changed in 1987. So that's it basically. That is a summary of the history of boxing. And that is why this sport has a far more established history than MMA. MMA, 1993. Boxing, modern boxing, 1743. So I think that's interesting. I'm going to round this up because I've covered a lot of issues here. Be interesting to see what happens between Furman and Garcia tonight. Um, as with Hey Bellew, I hope both guys keep safe. And I'm not saying that to be overly sentimental. It's just that we shouldn't forget 2016. The sport had a lot of things that happened, and Garcia Furman also has bad blood, like Hey Bellew had. So let me know your thoughts. If you are just interested in the sport, if you're just getting interested in the sport, I don't claim to be an absolute expert, but I do know a lot about the history of this sport, so feel free to ask questions. And I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching.